I'm going to try something different today. Try to speak clearly. That might be part of it. Later on, I'm going to try PowerPoint, since on a part of our lesson later on. So I'm going to have to figure out how to let people know on this what we've got up here on the screen. So bear with me. The reason for that is that there has been information that I've been wanting to share with you, and I haven't figured out how to do it. And our grandson now has got a job in California, is going to be leaving, so it was time for me to get him to instruct me on how to get this done. So he helped me last night, and we might be where we can work with this. We'll see. 1 Corinthians chapter 14 is part of this unit of 12, 13, and 14, where Paul talks about the spiritual gifts. One of the things that is evident all the way through this particular piece, the whole letter, if we could sum up the letter, one of the things that's so important for Paul is building up the church, building up the body. And so everything that he focuses upon is focused towards how we build up the body. So if there is one thing that we come out of Corinthians with, it's our understanding of the gospel, as Paul shares that, but build up, and I'm just going to say the church. And it is so crucial because it's a small group of people. It's a group that have not experienced this new faith. And so Paul is specific and very clear about some things. Now we're going to get to this whole thing with spiritual gifts. Evidently the church body had some conflict, some disagreement, some misunderstanding about the spiritual gifts. Probably part of that because they came out of the some of them came out of the ecstatic cults, Sibyl, Dionysus, where there was a lot of, spiritual ecstatic experience. And so they thought they were experts in this. And Paul then wants to instruct them that regardless of what they think, if it's not rooted in God's love, it is the ego. And we see that a lot. You know, one of the things that I have always resisted as at memorial services is an open mic. I even resist that in church with regards to prayer time, because invariably there is someone who talks about themselves through somebody else. And they go on and on and on and on and on. So there needs to be ways of sharing those things, but not to promote individual egos. And I think that's what Paul is running in here too, is this issue and this problem. Last week we saw where the root, the foundation of all of what Paul is talking about is love. That it is, in Star Wars terms, it is the force that shakes the universe. Is this understanding of God's love for us. And we need to incorporate that in as deep a sense as we can, not only God's love for us, but expressing our love for one another. Because that is what shakes and shapes and changes our world. Okay? Okay. Now then, starting verse 14. Paul says, I've got it on. Thank you. At the conclusion of chapter 13, he begins this section then, pursue love and strive for spiritual gifts. This has also been one of the things that's of contention within the church, because we are to strive for spiritual gifts, but we are to see those as a balance and integrated with regards to mind, wisdom, and spiritual experience. And one of the things that's happened, unfortunately, as we have come through the age of reason that dominated all that we are and do and be, if we can't see it and if we can't think it, it must not exist. And yet we all know that our spirituality is such a deep part of who we are. So it's essential that we understand that in the context of our faith. And so Paul talks about that here with regards to the spiritual gifts, even though in his mind the church at Corinth may have been exaggerating their own spiritual experience. He's not willing to deny it. And not once does he challenge them about it in terms of their experiences. He wants to put them in a context of strength and healing, a context of lifting up the body, the whole church. Does that make sense? Pursue love. Strive for the spiritual gifts. And we've talked about how many there are. You know, that's not just one. But strive for the spiritual gifts, and especially that you may prophesy. Now that doesn't mean foretell the future. Prophesy virtually is, the Greek word there is propheteo, which means to proclaim God's word. Any preacher is a prophet. And if you go back into the Old Testament, here are all the prophets, you know, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Jeremiah. What were they doing? They were prophesying, but they were proclaiming God's word. Okay? So we have taken a very small dimension of that and made prophecy such a big part of religious life and spiritual life in terms of some magical perception of the future. It's not. It's proclaiming God's word. And when one's in touch with life, you can pretty well determine what might happen. You know, if you support the Broncos, I could pretty well tell you the day the Broncos are playing in a playoff, there will be a certain amount of people with Bronco colors on. Unabashedly so. Now that's not magic. That's just kind of understanding what life and human beings are all about. Okay, does that make sense with regards to what we're saying here? Okay. For those who speak in tongues do not speak to people, but to God. That tongue speaking here, Paul is saying, is a way of speaking to God in a way that is beyond human experience. I think we have all had that experience where there just isn't a word to express the depth of our experience or our emotion. And that's somewhat what tongue speaking is all about. I was fascinated to learn that Cadman Caldwell, who was the president of the Claremont School of Theology when I was there, probably one of the world-renowned persons in Greek and New Testament theology, shared with us one night at his home he spoke in tongues. Had done it once in a worship experience in which he was so moved that it just occurred. Never had happened again, but he was a real scholar on these things. Yes?
Don't you think that's a very elitist thing?
It can be, and that's the problem. it can be. Just like wisdom can be an elitist thing. I know more than you do. That's the problem as we journey through life, is that there can be so many things that become elitist. All of us have our gifts, and unfortunately and I think it's because of individual insecurities, we need to feel better than someone else, so therefore we magnify our gifts as if they are above somebody else's gift, and then we begin to look down on them. I mean, that's one of the major problems in our world, is basic individual insecurity, and we magnify what we experience as being better than what you experience, and it just is not so. And so that's what Paul, I think, is trying to say here, is that anytime we utilize a gift to point to this one right here, we're on thin ice. The gifts need to bind the community and point to God. That's the function of any gift. Does that make sense? Okay. For nobody understands them, since they are speaking mysteries in the Spirit. Now, he doesn't judge that. He just says they're speaking mysteries in the Spirit. On the other hand, those who prophesy speak to other people for their upbuilding and encouragement and consolation. See where his focus is? He is putting prophecy first because he has a priority. He wants this church to grow. He wants them to understand the gospel. He wants them to understand the nature of God's love in their life. And he believes and understands rightly the only way that can happen is if you proclaim God's word. So he's not diminishing the Spirit. He's just putting a priority on prophecy for the purposes of building up the church.
I wonder why he never used the word evangel.
I think because that development of what the gospel was is a later development.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Of having, when at this particular point, we really haven't seen a big separation out in Paul's world between Judaism and the church. Mm-hmm. So there isn't this vis-a-vis good news, bad news emerging. When that begins to emerge, I think that's when evangelion becomes the good news as opposed to the news. Does that?
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. I wasn't thinking in terms of...
Those who speak in a tongue build up themselves, but those who prophesy build up the church. Now, I would like all of you to speak in tongues, but even more to prophesy. One who prophesies is greater than one who speaks in tongues, unless someone interprets, so that the church may be built up. Gene, there's your role. You can interpret as long as it's not Gene speaking. That's the temptation. The temptation is for Gene to speak and talk about Gene rather than Gene to interpret your tongue in terms of edifying the church and revealing something about God's Spirit moving among us. And that's a tough discipline. I think I shared with you one time, I had a lady leave our congregation because we're not spiritual enough. And we probably weren't. And I went to see her, and she was going to one of the meetings that night, and she told me she literally practiced speaking in tongues. And yes. And I said, now, no, wait a minute, Kim. How does this work? Well, she told me how it works because her preacher told her how it worked, and so she believed that she could practice in tongues, and she did. And so when she went to the services, she spoke in tongues.
We went to a workshop. I didn't go to this one. It was interfaith.
Anything that's legitimate can also, I don't want to say be illegitimate, but it can also be destructive. for the Spirit and for the community. So I think that's what we need to be very careful about. Now, brothers and sisters, if I come to you speaking in tongues, how will I benefit you unless I speak to you in some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or teaching? It is the same way with lifeless instruments. Now he goes into this metaphor with sound and instruments, which is really kind of fun. It is the same with lifeless instruments that produce sounds such as the flute or the harp. If they do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is being played? You know, I think my mother suffered more when I decided to learn the violin than anybody. That was...
Our son tried drums.
The drums. Well, that's what I went to. I love the drums. Oh.
In the summertime.
If they do not give distinct notes, how will anyone know what is being played? And if the bugle gives an indistinct sound, who will get ready for battle? So, you know, here Paul is saying even the speaking in tongues needs to have clarity with regards to its purpose. If in a tongue you utter speech that is not intelligible, how will anyone know what is being said? For you will be speaking into the air or into the wind, as Paul speaks. There are doubtless many different kinds of sounds in the world, and nothing is without sound. If then I do not know the meaning of a sound, I will be a foreigner to the speaker, and the speaker a foreigner to me. So with yourselves, since you are eager for spiritual gifts, strive to excel in them for building up the church.
Not self-edification.
And not self-edification. That's the peace. That's the peace we live with. Therefore, one who speaks in a tongue should pray for the power to interpret, either themselves or someone else. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unproductive. You can see he's got a little bias here. Paul doesn't hide his biases. Even though he tries to say everything is on an equal footing, he has a bias. Just like that wonderful phrase I love about Gentile Christians. You know, I mean, he can't just say they're Christians. He had to put that little... What should I do then? I will pray with the Spirit, but I will pray with the mind also. I will sing praise with the Spirit, but I will sing praise with the mind also. Otherwise, if you say a blessing with the Spirit, how can anyone in the position of an outsider say amen? How can anyone who does not understand say amen? Agree. Verily, verily.
What I thought when I went to my daughter's church, and each time I would visit, the same man would be speaking in tongues during the service, and nobody paid me attention, and the service just went on.
Mm-hmm.
And no one ever said anything about it, or it didn't seem to be important.
You know, without having been there, there wasn't a building up of the church.
No.
And that's what Paul is speaking about.
Yeah.
Whatever we do needs to be about building up the church. Where are we? Otherwise, if you say a blessing with the Spirit, how can anyone in the position of the outsider say amen? Verily, verily, or an act of approval. To your thanksgiving, since the outsider does not know what you're saying. For you may give thanks well enough, but the other person is not built up. So all of what Paul is saying about this point, which I think he says through all of his letters, our purpose is to build someone else up. And in so doing, what happens?
Well, they probably build up other stuff well.
Well, but the way to strengthen oneself is to build another up. The best way to learn is to teach. If you really want to learn something, teach it to somebody. That's right. I mean, that's probably the reason that I love doing this, is because I love the research part of what I learned. Nevertheless, in church, I would rather speak 5 words with my mind in order to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. Brothers and sisters, do not be children in your thinking. Be infants in evil and adults in your thinking. It is, in the law it is written, by people of strange tongues and by the lips of foreigners I will speak to this people, yet even then they will not listen to me. They will not be able to hear me. It's a way of God. God will speak that way. But they're not often able to hear. They need someone to interpret and to speak my word. Tongues then are a sign not for believers but for unbelievers. Who prophesy is not for unbelievers but for believers. You know, Paul gets a little esoteric here once in a while. I'm not really quite certain what all he means by that. Sometimes anyway, he goes down pathways that I just have a difficult time following. And it's really interesting if we had different translations here. Translators have a difficult time following the Greek. Because, where he's going with this is not really clear because the Greek construction is not very clear. Which leads to a possibility. This is one of our first encounters, and we're going to get to that later on when I ask you the question about the parentheses. Leads to the possibility of what's called a gloss. Does anybody know what a gloss is? Okay, let's take a time out now, so if I can get this started again. Okay. I don't know if you can see this or not. One of the things about the text, the biblical text that we have, is that nowhere do we have an original. Okay? There is not an original letter to Corinth. There isn't an original Romans or Mark. They are all a series of codices and parts of manuscripts. Okay? The one most comprehensive text that we have is Isaiah. It's not an original. It goes back to the Qumran community at the time of Jesus. And it was found at Qumran in a cave. You've all heard the story about that. And this is a picture of that scroll. Okay. Do you see this right here? Somebody wrote in the margin a correction. It's called a gloss. Now, how far back there were written scrolls before this one, we don't have. We have bits and pieces of Isaiah scrolls that are put together so that scholars are able to make the best educated guess about a text. Now, I hope this does not destroy faith, because I think it enhances faith with regards to how these things come about, okay? This is here someone corrected, and we don't know what it is, something in the text, okay?
You call it a gloss?
A gloss. A scribal gloss. It is added. Now then, how do those come about? Here is an example of another codice that was found. That's a piece. It's a piece of a psalm. But you see what happens is it's tore out, tore out, tore out, tore out, tore out. Okay? So they're able to read most of it, but what goes in this section here? Sometimes they're fortunate enough to find another jar full of scraps, and that's really what they were, that has this piece. Sometimes not. So much of what's in here is filled in through oral tradition, the oral tradition that was passed on, and what is the context of all that was written here making this determination. Okay? Is that any questions about that?
Now, who would do that?
Now, these were done by in the Christian community, they were done in monasteries by monks who would spend hours going over all the pieces that they have, trying to put them together like a jigsaw puzzle, and then talking about what does this mean, what does this say, based upon what we know before. Yes, John?
Perhaps that's what you were talking about last week. You celebrate the celibate.
Yeah, that's it. You got it.
But I think that when you talk about the seriousness, it's really, when we think of oral tradition, we may think of something like our game of gossip.
Yeah.
But then oral tradition was a much more serious and accurate passing down of intimacy.
That's right. And I want to step on that because that's absolutely so accurate. One of the things that we need to really understand, the responsibility of the oral communicator, because the oral communicator knew that what they're passing on is the identity of the community, the foundation of the community, and the Spirit of God at work in the community. Probably today, the best example of that is a couple of places. One is many of our Native American communities who still hand on the tradition and are very careful about that. The other, I can't remember his name right now. Anyway, back in the 40s and 50s, after the war, there was a Lebanese scholar, a Christian scholar, that wanted to try to verify his Greek text. So what he did was, he went into the Bedouin communities that he had a couple of parameters. First of all, there was no television. Of course, that was before television, but there was no connection with the outside world. They did not have any automobiles, and they were virtually isolated from much of the world around them. Then he built up a relationship with them, and then he began to ask them to tell him and they were Christian. That was the other thing. They were Christian communities. And he began to ask them to tell him the gospel. And he could sit there and almost read his Greek word for word as they told him the gospel, because it had been handed down from generation to generation to generation. And a father taught a son, and that's the way it happened, a son, and the son had to be able to repeat back to the father precisely before they were able to be considered a rabbi, a teacher, or a priest in the village. So, that's what we're dealing with. Is we're not just talking about hearsay. We're talking about people who took this very seriously. Okay, does that make sense? Yes.
The origin of the bar mitzvah?
That's part of it. Is that young people had to know the tradition and be able to recite Torah. So it's not just hearsay. You hear so much about what we think is in the Bible. How many wise men were there? Yeah, we don't know. We always have in our nativity 3. Why? 3 gifts. But that doesn't mean that there were only 3, or it doesn't mean there were 3. We assume a lot, but if you were handing this down, you would have been very clear. If someone would have said 3 wise men, and said, no, doesn't say that. Okay? So this isn't just, I think this is what it says. This is a lot of scholarly work interacting with the text that we have and the oral tradition that they have.
Now down at the bottom is what so is that translating those?
It's talking about that, the above. Okay, then let's, here is just, I don't know if you can see that or not. This is smaller. I need to push this back. Anyway, this is just a partial list of the various papyri and codices that we have parts of, that we use to construct the New Testament. That's only a partial list. Okay? So, it's possible, I want you to hear that, it's possible that this verse that is somewhat incomprehensible on a couple of pieces. First of all, it is not in the style of Paul. Paul, before this and after that's pretty clear. Here it's really, the Greek is different. The structure of the sentence is different. Even the content has some Paul to it, but it's not clearly Paul. Does that make sense? So it's questionable. Is this Paul or was this a disciple of Paul trying to clarify what he thought Paul said?
How much of
Just this section here about, and then we're going to get to 35. There are signs for believers, but for unbelievers. Prophecy is for unbelievers and not for believers. Then we probably go on to Paul. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say that you're out of your mind? See, that sounds pretty Paul, doesn't it? I mean, that's pretty clear. And that's pretty Paul because Paul, up to this particular point, has been talking about being able to teach and preach in clarity so that the outsiders would understand. I mean, that's important to build up the church. And it's also important to think about that Paul wants clarity because a lot of these people are coming out of the ecstatic religions, and if they come in and don't understand what's being said about the nature of God, would say, oh, Christian cult's just like any other cult. You're no different. You're just ecstatic. But here Paul is very clear, those who come in, he wants them to understand. So this verse sounds very Pauline. The one before, we don't know. Is it Paul? Doesn't sound much like Paul. It's got some of the elements of what Paul's trying to say, so it's quite possible that somebody was trying to clarify it and didn't do a good job.
So what verse specifically are you talking
Okay.
about? Mine says 34 and 35.
Oh, I'm going to get to that. Right now we're at 20. We're at 22. Tongues then are a sign not for believers but for unbelievers, while prophecy is not for unbelievers but for believers. That it doesn't make sense. And that's right. That's right. That's if it's consistent with everything that Paul has said, then that should be reversed. That's the reason that scholars really question whether this verse is of Paul or not. And if it's not, why? What were they trying to do? What were they trying to say? And no one can answer that. Then you go on. I mean, the rest of it is very Paul. That which is before is very Paul. If therefore the whole church comes together and all speak in tongues and outsiders or unbelievers enter, will they not say, what, you're out of your mind? What's going on here? Paul wants everybody to understand. But if all prophecy, an unbeliever or an outsider who enters is reproved by all and called to account by all, after the secrets of the unbeliever's heart are disclosed, the person will bow down before God. The only way that the secrets of the unbeliever's heart will be disclosed is if they understand the nature of the gospel and measure their life against the gospel. Then they will understand and will be revealed. Does that make sense?
Which also says the opposite of what verse 22 says.
That's right. So you see, once we get by 22, we get back into Paul's, what appears to be consistent with Paul's teaching. Verse 22 just doesn't seem to get it. Okay? Okay. 26. What should be done then, my friends? When you come together, each one of you has a hymn, a lesson. Here's something about the nature of the early worship service that we kind of can surmise. When you come together, each one has a hymn, a lesson, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. Let all things be done. This is, again, building up the church. So whatever's done, it needs to be done with that goal. If anyone speaks in a tongue, let there be only 2 or 3, and at the most 3. Let's not spend all day in this, okay, folks?
If there are 3 of them, do they understand each other?
Probably not. There needs to be someone to interpret. They understand, and they might be able to interpret. You might understand Melba and be able to interpret, but Melba may not understand Bev. I mean, just because you have a tongue doesn't mean that you understand the same tongue, because it's a spiritual ecstasy that really belongs to each person. And it's only if there is a gift to interpret it.
Does the speaker know what they're saying?
Yes. They may not know the interpretation. They know that they have connected with God in a very deep and real way.
Well, what I meant was, do they know the interpretation of what they're saying?
They may or may not.
Have you ever interpreted or know anyone who has interpreted?
I have not interpreted. I had an ecstatic experience one time. It was an out-of-the-body experience. I was co-directing camp at Loch Levin in Southern California. It was one of those weeks where the first couple of days of the week was the week from hell, literally. These kids were just... Anyway, I won't go through all of that, but by the end of the week, we just cut everything off on a Wednesday morning and gathered everybody in the dining room and said, we're going to fix this or we're going home. And so we broke into small group. We did all kinds of things. Anyway, Friday night we had a communion service. We were in the lodge at Loch Levin. We had a communion table. We were singing, and the kids were seated in the form of a fish. That was the days when we were doing the fish around a table. Table was here, there, here. And Stan Smith, I think, was at the other end. We were co-directing. I can't even remember. I'm pretty certain it was Stan Smith, because we did a lot of these things together. And we had fractured the bread, poured out the cup, words of institution. And then the kids were coming to the table, and we were singing as they were coming. And the kids on this side were coming down this side, and the kids on this side were coming this way. So we had this going. And I think all of this attributed to it. And as we were doing that, Jesus said, this is my body broken for you. This is my blood poured out for you. Because on this side they were receiving wine. On this side they were receiving bread. So I was giving bread here. Stan down there was giving wine and bread, as they were doing this and singing. And all of a sudden I was above it. I could see it. I was like I was in the ceiling. And it was this most beautiful orchestrated movement and a sense of unity and peace that, it's just incredible. I still get there when I think about it. The only time I've ever experienced that. Only experienced it, who knows what time, Could have been a second, could have been 5 seconds, it could have been a minute. Scared me, and yet there was a sense of peace. And it took me a long time to tell anybody about it. But it was a gift. It was a gift from God. I can try to interpret what all it meant. Other people can interpret what it meant. All I know is at that moment I really felt connected with God, with Stan, with people. And I think we have all had those kinds of moments when we know. Maybe we can't say the words, but we know. And that's what Paul is trying to say here. When you let the Spirit of God move, you know. Does that make sense? Okay. Let me get to, I want to get to 34 before we finish up this morning, because this is another important one. This is a major, all right, I asked the question, why do you think it's in parentheses? Does anybody have any? Why do you think it's in parentheses? It wasn't Paul. More than likely. And let's go back. Well, this thing doesn't stay on. Anyway, you remember all of the second and third generation? What the suspicion is that a second or a third generation copy of Paul's letter, this was inserted. Does anybody have any suspicion of why this might have been inserted?
The culture of the day.
The culture of the day, and men were taking charge of the church. Because, let's go over this. There are five, well, let me read it, and then there are at least 5 reasons why this probably is not Paul. Okay? Parentheses open. As in all the churches of the saints. That's not Paul. Paul doesn't say that. He's very specific. He doesn't say in all the churches of the saints. That's not Paul. Okay. Women should be silent in the churches. Now, just before this, he has talked about let all have their gift and share their gift. Okay? But now, men are taking over the church, and so we got to add a little teaching here. Women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law says. When does Paul go back to the law and use the law to undergird the gospel? Never. He roots the gospel experience in the law, but he does not use the law to interpret the gospel experience. Does that make sense? Do I need to say that again? Okay. For they are not permitted to speak, must be as subordinate as the law says. If there is anything they desire to know, let them ask their husbands at home.
So the denomination Church of Christ pulls right off.
Oh, they do. And Missouri Synod Lutheran pull right out of this. They dismiss the entire letters of Paul and embrace this couple of verses.
Yeah, but throughout this it says brothers. It never says brothers and sisters.
That's right.
So is any of it, well, doesn't Paul talk like brothers and sisters?
Well, he uses the form of the reason the New Revised Standard Version says brothers and sisters is that the term adelphoi, which is often translated brothers, is virtually neutral. It is neither male nor female, masculine nor feminine. So to try to be as consistent, it really irks me, quite frankly, when people say you're being politically correct. No, I'm not being politically correct. I'm being translational correct. Did you get the idea that bugs me a little bit? Did you hear that? Okay, good. I'm glad it came across. I didn't have to hide it here. It has nothing to do with being politically correct. It has everything to do with being consistent with the integrity of the text. Okay? All right. Okay, we'll move on. For it is shameful for a woman to speak in church. Where does Paul say that? Or did the Word of God originate with you, or are you the only ones it has reached? Then he goes on, and then it's Paul. All right, here are 5 reasons why this may not be Paul. Okay? And I'll try to be calm. And I will try to say this without getting tongue-tied. Okay, first one.
You're talking about what you have just said.
That's right. This parentheses open, parentheses closed. Okay. First of all, many of these manuscripts that I listed put this at the end. They don't even put it in the body of the text. These verses are not 35 or 33b through 36. These verses are attached to the end of the letter, kind of as an addendum.
They're an asterisk.
They're an asterisk. That's exactly right. That's a great way of putting it. So many of the manuscripts that we have don't even have it in the body of the letter. They have it attached to the end. Okay? Suggesting that a scribe somewhere took this addendum and put it into the body of the text, thinking they were doing a good job because, of course, men need to be in charge. All right, 2. This is in direct contradiction to what Paul has taught in chapter 11. I'm surprised some of you didn't jump all over me on this one. Chapter 11, verse 12 through 16. Go back and read it. Chapter 11, beginning with verse 12. It is not about a woman being silent in the church. It has everything to do with a woman covering her head. Nothing in there about silence. Everything about maintaining a distinction between male and female in the church, and the way that was done was with covering the head. Okay? So, number 2 is that it's just not consistent with Paul. 3. How many times do women play a prominent role in the church? Huh?
I was waiting for that.
You know, women played a significant role in Paul's church. And he names them: Phoebe, Prisca, Lydia, Junia, Eudora, Syntyche. All women, all play a significant role in the life of the church. Another one, verse 4, as I said when I started this out, addresses the churches. The only case in the letter where the issues are not directed to whom? The Corinthians. Excuse me. He is writing this letter to the church at Corinth, first of all, because of a report that has come from Chloe's people, and second, because of a letter that we don't have any access to that was written to Paul asking him questions. And so then he responds to the church at Corinth. He does not say this general sweeping all of the churches. Nowhere. Except in that several verses. Okay? And then the other thing that I responded to, the unqualified appeal to the law as requiring women's subordination is not consistent with the way Paul approached Scripture. As I said, he roots the gospel in the understanding of God working through Torah, but he does not take Torah to validate the gospel. Does that make sense? Okay. So, and Paul certainly is not legalistic. He definitely does not believe that one has to follow the law to have a relationship with God. He preaches time and time again that the relationship with God is a gift given to everyone, male and female, rich nor poor, Jew nor Greek, all are children of God. There you go. There you go. So, those are the 5 things that get me sputtering. we just had an outbreak up here.
Did you?
Yeah.
Outbreak of good stuff.
I hope. they didn't walk out and they haven't taken after me yet. But
Well, if I can take 2 seconds.
okay.